Good evening. Welcome to the Visionaries Roundtable, Preservation and Change in Chestnut Hill's Future, a public discussion to examine the tensions and opportunities between preservation and development, organized by the Chestnut Hill Conservancy and Historical Society. And now, filmmaker Nathaniel Kahn.
That's very exciting. I've never been introduced by the Wizard of Oz before. Thank you, Dan. This is a great honor to be here, a great pleasure to come back to Chestnut Hill. And I want to take you back. I'll keep this very brief. There are much more august members of your community to speak with you this evening, but I just want to take you back to 1970 and an evening of speculation which happened that year. It was organized by the wonderful Shirley Hanson, who's here this evening, and also by Nancy Hubby, who was a wonderful person and mother of a friend of mine who went to Germantown Friends with me. That particular evening was not held in this room, but was held in the gymnasium, actually, because 800 people showed up. So I'm feeling a little outclassed, but at any rate, it's a nice, very nice audience here. And that particular evening, at this evening of speculation, were three of my favorite people, Robert Venturi, who happens to be my godfather, among other things, and Romelda Jurgala, who was an honorary godfather and a dear friend, and of course, my father, Louis Kahn. It was a very interesting evening because the concerns that these people were talking about are some of the same concerns that face all of you today. And I'm glad that we still face those concerns and that it's not a moot point. It's very much not a moot point. It's very much an active point. And I just want to read you a few sort of words that my father spoke in 1970. Dan retrieved them for me from a recording that was made of that evening, and I find them quite interesting. He said, I won't imitate his voice, it's quite a bit higher than mine, but he said, and you'll have to bear with him, he was a speaker many times when I've listened to recordings and people have said what a wonderful speech it was, one has to say, gee, after hearing it, you had to be there. But actually, if you kind of get between the words a bit, there's a lot there. And he said, we can only know Chestnut Hill as a spirit. The old houses have become inseparable from the trees and the landscape. One is not isolated from the rest. They must be counted as though what is there is part of the landscape, and new things must have agreement. Very important word for him, agreement. Continued, the indiscriminate use of land would do much harm, more harm than good, to the entity that is the city. Chestnut Hill must retain its gardens and the balance of land and not give way to need. Need alone is not enough because it is unspirited. Chestnut Hill inspires us. Okay, there's a lot in that. And I don't want to unpack it too much, but I do want to say a couple things about my own experience at Chestnut Hill. Growing up here in Chestnut Hill inspired me too. I can't say it inspired me socially. Being the half-Jewish son of a unwed mother, going to the Holly Hop was really not a lot of fun. I don't know if the Holly Hop still exists, but boy, it sucked. Which wasn't to say that there weren't lots of people I would have liked to have spoken to, but I was simply too shy or something like that. And I've never set foot in Springside, though I longed to as a young person. But it's very nice to be here tonight. However, socially, of course, I did find wonderful friends here. And I will say that Chestnut Hill inspired me greatly for its nature. And growing up first in Cherokee Apartments, which was designed by my father's partner, Oscar Stoneroff, and then later on Towanda Street, at a carriage house that belonged to Francis Adler, a wonderful eye doctor who lived on Hartwell Lane. and a dear, dear friend. The environment of this community that you have, the physical environment, is unspeakably beautiful. And having been to many places in the world, been to India and been to the Far East and been all over the world, there's nothing like Chestnut Hill at this season right now. It's just magnificent. We have trees here that are like nowhere else in the world. The mid-Atlantic trees are just magnificent. And to see the tulip trees and to see the sycamore trees down by the creek and the covered bridge and the nesting Kentucky warblers and cerulean warblers, unfortunately, are gone. But we have so much, and growing up with that was just astonishing. And in the houses of my friends, to have this sense that nature and architecture, nature and building were in such harmony, this is rare anywhere in the world, everywhere in the world. So this is something that I carry with me and that I cherish. I don't live in Chestnut Hill now, but I always think of it. And I also remember when I first learned the word development. And I lived on Towanda Street, and two houses went up. There's a property called the Binderton Estate. You may know it. It's a large brick house that is right at the junction of Towanda Street and Chestnut Hill Avenue. And two houses, as we used to say, ticky-tacky houses, went up there. And I asked my mother, what is that? And she said, oh, that's a development. And, development has the ring in my ear still of something that is just, there's something wrong with development for itself. And I think I go back to my father's words. The reason development for its own purposes isn't right is because it's only coming from need. It's just coming from, I need to make a buck, I need to house someone, I need to do something. We'll develop this area. It doesn't mean that one can't build something new, and I'm very much pro-building and pro-architecture. I love architecture, but architecture is different from development. And I think I'm assuming that that's a little bit about what perhaps will be spoken about this evening. And I think that one of the things growing up here that I really came to understand and respect was how architects who have worked here over a long period of time have not been developers, even those who technically were, perhaps like the Woodwards. They were not thinking of it just as a way to make a buck or to house people or even to expand the train line. They were really thinking about the character of this place, which is a place that very much derives its greatness from the natural amenities that are here. And that certainly moved through all the architects who've built here in the past, like marvelous George Howe, who High Hollow is a magnificent house. And it also moved through the architects of the modern period who worked here. And I think of my father's house, the Esherick House that he built on Sunrise Lane, Sunset? Is it? Anyway, I'm thinking of the Fiddler on the Roof here. Which is it? Anyway. And also, of course, of the marvelous Venturi House at the end of the road. And of the wonderful house which I went through as a boy, Dorothy White's house, which was designed by Aldo Giorgolo. All three of these titans of modernism designed beautiful houses here, and they're in scale with the place. They respond to the place. They're not mega mansions. They're not mansions at all. They're works of architecture, and they're extraordinarily thoughtful to the character of the land. That's also true for the wonderful landscape architects who worked here. And I think of Ian McCart, whose house, Davidson Road, of Fred Peck, who did such a marvelous job on many properties, but especially Pastorius Park. These are people who really, really cared about what you have here. And that has continued too. And I think of some of the houses that have happened since then. And two that just come to mind. I love Ailey Atala's house nearby that you should see. And a dear friend of mine who worked with my father, Raphael Villamil, is also here this evening. And his house on Carroll Lane is a magnificent work of modern architecture. These are people who live in your community and have built great works of art and have responded to the natural environment that is here and built respectfully within this environment. So I hope that this is helpful in kicking off this evening and in thinking about the words of my father, which I think still resonate today, that ultimately there must be agreement. And this idea of agreement is, let's talk about it. Let's really think about what it is to build here and how we want to grow and how it can happen in a way that does not in any way destroy or detract from the great character that you have here in Chestnut Hill. So I'd like to take this moment now to introduce Shirley Hanson, who in 1970 brought my father here. Thank you for doing that, Shirley, and thank you for bringing me here. Before we finish, I want to say one last thing, which is I also want to just give a word out to Dan and Paul, who acquired the Esherick House. We were very worried about this, just because one doesn't know what's going to happen to a house. Will people mess with it? Will they add to it? Will they screw it up? And Dan and Paul have taken such beautiful care of the Esherick House, and we are honored that they have kept my father's legacy alive in that manner. So ultimately, when we have this discussion of agreement, it's also about the preservation and the protection of great works of architecture. Shirley Hanson.
I was going to talk a little bit about the evening of speculation, Chestnut Hill's future. You might think it's a little bit unusual for a historical society, which we were until we changed our name just recently to the Conservancy. But as a historical society, we were always very much attuned to the future. And we did an architectural survey of all of Chestnut Hill as one of our first projects. And of course, we're absolutely delighted to include, and it was the conclusion, the magnificent conclusion of the book with the Venturi House, the Kahn House, and Ramado Jorgala's house. So the evening of speculation, Chestnut Hill's future, was really not unusual for our thinking. And Nathaniel really described it probably as well or better than I could, although I was there. And so I would just like to go on from there and talk for a moment about my experience with Louis Kahn. I was in charge of writing about the event and about the architects and their houses for the Chestnut Hill Local. So it was my good fortune to be able to talk to Louis Kahn about the Esherick House. And you heard from Nathaniel about the really poetic and wise way that his father described architecture. And that really inspired me as I listened to him and then thought about the Esherick House. And so these are my thoughts inspired by Louis Kahn. The house has a presence which cannot be explained solely in terms of its parts, and which surely transcends the sum of these parts. The architect, Louis Kahn, through the design of the house, has made a statement about the nature of man. The house shelters man with nobility and is a fitting home for his soul. And that's what I wrote. And I was reading it over as I was thinking about this evening, and it suddenly occurred to me, these are the same words that I can use to describe Chestnut Hill tonight. And I'll just put it into Chestnut Hill's terms. Chestnut Hill has a presence which cannot be explained solely in terms of its parts, and surely transcends the sum of these parts. Chestnut Hill shelters human beings with nobility, or you can call it integrity, and is a fitting home for their souls. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Lori Salganikoff, who is our remarkable executive director.
Good evening. 3 years into its existence, in 1970, the Chestnut Hill Historical Society was able to attract these great minds to speak about how they saw Chestnut Hill and how they imagined its future. They were not primarily preservationists, but in fact architects who had just built iconic, next slide, unique new buildings, next slide, here in Chestnut Hill that reflected their mid-century time of creation, next slide. And then the next two slides. In harmony with older buildings that define the community and are now considered historic resources worthy of preservation on their own. Next slide. In our 50th anniversary year, the newly renamed Chestnut Hill Conservancy chose to again convene a panel of thought leaders. During the intervening years, the organization has broadened its mission to integrate preservation advocacy, archival collections, and open space conservation. We are, in fact, the nation's first accredited urban land trust. This evening's discussion is part of our efforts to help the community better understand what is environmentally, historically, and architecturally significant so that we can protect our unique character as we help manage informed change and new introductions. Next slide. The map panels that you saw as you arrived are another related part of this effort to balance preservation, conservation, and development here. Next slide. These maps have been created as a part of a study, an effort to help us understand where we stand now, funded by the William Penn Foundation. Next slide. This study is led in partnership by the Conservancy and the Chestnut Hill Community Association, and the maps were produced by our consultant, the Natural Lands Trust. These maps, next slide, other information, and a tape from this evening will be available online through our website before the City Planning Commission begins its public process this fall for the creation of the Upper Northwest District Plan. This will be the final part of the city's comprehensive plan. Just to explain this map right here, what you see is the result of a study that was done by Friends of the Wissahickon, and the different levels of priority for conservation are just depicted here, the darkest purple being the highest priority, and the lighter purple priority properties. As you can see, most of Chestnut Hill is a priority for conservation to protect the Wissahickon watershed. Next slide. These take a while to load. This actually is a map of the National Register Historic District, which has, could you focus that a little bit? Or maybe it's me. What you see here, or kind of what you fuzzy see, is basically the buildings of Chestnut Hill. Because of the work of this organization back in 1987, we know the history and have evaluated the significance architecturally, socially, historically of every single building here in Chestnut Hill. We know its age. We know, we can think about the buildings and the watershed land that is here. We have evaluated that and have brought things much further. And this study actually brings together for the very first time all of the different levels of planning that has happened in the past. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Tonight's keynote and panelists were invited to bring their own particular perspectives on preservation, conservation, and change. The Conservancy is delighted to facilitate what is sure to be a lively discussion tonight and going forward. However, please note that our guests' opinions do not necessarily reflect those of the Conservancy. Next slide, please. a guide to the rest of the evening. We will first hear, or next hear, from Witold Rybczynski, who will spark the conversation with a keynote that no one but he has seen, entitled Developing Chestnut Hill. Our panelists will then each share their thoughts on prompt questions they've been given, which are detailed in your programs. During this time, we will collect any questions you would like all or a particular panelist to discuss. You've been given sheets in your programs, and there should have been golf pencils as well. And finally, a panel discussion moderated, as in 1970, by the president of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, now a Chestnut Hill native, Gail Harrity. Next slide. This is also your time to engage. And this is a picture of the cards on which to write the questions for our panelists, which we will collect from you during their 5-minute introductions. Please hold them up and one of us will collect it from you, perhaps pass to the aisles. We won't get to all of the questions though. We hope you will leave this evening really looking at and thinking about why you love this place and stay engaged. In fact, please sign our mailing list for this effort if you haven't done so already. Next slide, please. And now I'm honored to bring to the stage Witold Rybczynski.
Good evening. Thank you, Laurie. Could we see a slide, please? I like to listen to the radio, and I particularly like WRTI, which is our NPR station, one of our NPR stations, and because they play jazz and classical, which are the two kinds of music that I like, so it's perfect for me. And there's a daily program that I occasionally run across, which is called, I think, Composer's Notebook or something like that. And it's a very short little thing where they talk about connections between contemporary music and classical music and different composers and musicians. And they have a little kind of closing line, which I thought when I was organizing this talk really was very relevant. And it says that all music was once new. And I think it's to remind people that we really should listen to that horrible modern music that orchestras like to play, but it also reminds us that what sounds so traditional and like it's been there forever hasn't been there forever. It started. There was a moment when it was brand new, and I thought it would be interesting to keep in mind as we talk about Chestnut Hill, and which we've heard already sounds like a kind of natural phenomenon that just happened. Chestnut Hill was once new. Actually, not very long ago, within the century or slightly longer than 100 years, which is really not a very long time. Certainly not a long time in terms of Philadelphia history even. And Chestnut Hill was new. And it wasn't just new, it was actually radically new. Chestnut Hill was a place of experimentation, and as I'll show you, it was recognized as such. It wasn't Chestnut Hill didn't grow naturally. It was, I'm afraid to say, a development, a real estate development. Without, next please. Without Henry Howard Houston, there would be no Chestnut Hill because he brought the railroad to Chestnut Hill. And it's kind of obvious today. We say, well, sure, you take the train and you go into Center City, or you were in Center City and you come out here by train. That was a radical idea, the idea that you would move out here, and not just for a weekend, not just for your summer holidays, because it was cooler up here. Remember, this is before air conditioning. But that you would actually live here. And that was a very hard sell if you were a developer. I mean, I'm sure people thought he was a little crazy to buy thousands of acres up here and bring people up here. And he brought people up here by bringing the horse show up here. It was one of the premier social events of Philadelphia. And he figured, as developers always have, you need a magnet, and if all you have is empty land, that's not much of a magnet, but a horse show is. Later he built a hotel, which is part of Springside School, and that was a way of bringing people up here, showing them that it was a nice place, and then hopefully selling them a house or selling them some land while they were up here. Eventually, of course, over 25, 30 years, Chestnut Hill took root. You can see on the map, it's a long way, and in those days, Chestnut Hill was just a little hamlet. It had a kind of reputation because of the Wissahickon Creek as a place of great beauty, of natural beauty, and people came here because of the creek, but otherwise it was a little hamlet, and there was, between the city and Chestnut Hill was really nothing. There were fields and farms and so on. Philadelphia had this very ambitious city county, but it was really mostly empty land. Next. Houston's architectural ideas were less radical. He really wanted to bring really rich people up here. That's why he had the horse show. And he built houses like this with the Hewitt brothers, large sort of arts and crafts houses. This is the end of the 19th century. He wasn't going out on a limb architecturally with these things. It was pretty conservative. And he was obviously trying to appeal to people, but this radical idea of moving out, far out, 10 miles from Center City out here, needed sort of a pretty conservative architectural image, and this is the kind of thing he was doing. I love this photograph because you realize all these beautiful landscapes of Chestnut Hill are man-made, and they're much later. When Houston was building, there was nothing here. It was flat. You can see there are no trees around this house. They're probably saplings that are today these wonderful, beautiful big trees. But in those days, somebody had to plant them. It wasn't a natural occurrence. Next. The man who was more radical in many ways was George Woodward. He was trained as a doctor, although he was really a developer in terms of what he actually did with his life. But as Nathaniel said, an unusual kind of developer. He had ambitions beyond simply making money. He started with a pretty good sort of cash influx from his father-in-law. But he had ambitions, and part of his ambitions next were fueled by what was going on in England. And the big urban movement of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th was the Garden City movement. It's at least as big as environmentalism is today. It was huge. Every European language has a word for Garden City. The French, the Germans, the Spanish. And they were built all over Europe. They came from essentially a book written by a British, not a planner, not an architect, but a sort of self-made prophet, I suppose. But this book was very inspiring, and it inspired people to build these human settlements, which, as these posters from England show, and these were the three earliest garden cities, Welwyn and Letchworth, and then Hampstead Garden Suburb. They were linked to the city in some cases by trains, but you can see the images. They were places that were sophisticated. They were urban in one way, but rural in another way. They were green places. They were unlike London, which you see on that center poster in the background. And I think Woodward and to some extent Houston also had this image in mind. Certainly Woodward did, because he was very interested in the Garden City, and he was aware of what was going on in England. There is this sense that out here you're in Chestnut Hill and it's cool and green, and it's very different from the city. It's connected to the city by trains. This is still too early for cars, certainly in England. But it's connected to the city, you shop in the city, you socialize in the city, so it's not an escape from the city, except in the sense that your home is in a very different sort of environment, a green environment. But this poster on the right shows this is not about sort of playing at being farmers, or this is bringing the sophistication of the city out of the city into a very different sort of environment. Next. But what Woodward did was quite different from what his father-in-law was doing. And the first things he built on Benezet Street were aimed at a quite different market. He was really trying to attract young, middle-class couples, families to Chestnut Hill. He realized that it wasn't enough to have the 19th century equivalent of hedge fund managers living here, that would be an unbalanced community. He wanted all sorts of people. I wouldn't say he wanted blue-collar workers necessarily. He wasn't that much of an idealist, but he certainly wanted young families who couldn't afford the kind of big houses that Houston had built. And so he built with Louis During a series of houses on Benezet Street. These are little twins, but you can see how much effort has gone into them. These were rented houses. Very important from a development point of view because these houses had to last. Woodward assumed correctly, as it turned out, that they would be owning these houses for 100+ years. These houses are almost exactly 100 years old today, and there's many of them still owned by the same family. So there's a lot of effort in these houses. They're simple, they're not, During is not throwing money away, but he's certainly not doing a bare bones type of thing. And they're really very beautiful little structures. Next. Next. You can see Benezet Street, it's just, this was the very first thing that they did together. It's just two sides of the street, but he curved the houses to sort of create a little sense of that this isn't just like being on Walnut Street in Center City. This is a different sort of street. The street is already there. He can't fiddle around with the shape of the street, but he can shape the houses around the street, and you can see the twins at the top there, and then a mixture of twins and a few singles, and then these very unusual quadruple houses, which were really an invention, I think, mostly of Woodward, with During working out the details. But a twin shares one wall, and Woodward thought, why can't we share two walls? Not by building row houses, which were an urban form very much associated with Philadelphia, but a different sort of house. And he came up with this idea of a quadruple house, simply to save money. Because he wanted to rent these houses at less expensive rents than the twins. Incidentally, these are big houses. Next. These are 5-6 bedroom houses. And that's a theme, a little bit of my talk, is that we have beautiful houses in Chestnut Hill, but they were houses built for a very different time, when people stayed married, which we don't do so much anymore, when people lived less long than we do. So you don't have single people or elderly couples living together in houses. Families were smaller, and most people here, I assume, don't have domestic help living in. These people did. A middle-class family, if you look carefully at these plans, there's a big staircase in the middle with a skylight, a beautiful kind of idea. There's also a second stair, and that's for the domestic help, so they can go from the kitchen to their room without interfering with the life of the house. And these are not extremely wealthy people. These are young families, middle-class families. So the number of people per house is actually quite big. And that's a characteristic of the houses of that period. Next. And here you can see, again, the houses are not fancy, but they have a lot of character. They have porches. They have a lot of comfortable features. They also have this beautiful thing here. During loved to put these cast iron things on chimneys. I don't know what they're called, but they have no functional purpose at all. But there's a Q on the chimney standing for quadruple. I have one on my house, which was designed by During, and it says ICE, I-C-E, because it was once an ice house, and he converted it. And it's kind of putting a memory of what had been there before. And you can see these in Westmount area and Chestnut Hill. There's a lot of these quad houses, and it's a really interesting and completely original idea. Nobody had done this before. Frank Lloyd Wright did it later, and he did it in Ardmore, so that you could perhaps argue that he must have seen it in Chestnut Hill. But he certainly did it later, and Woodward and During really were the pioneers of this form. Next. But Woodward was not just trying to invent everything on his own. He was very much aware of what was going on in England. And this is a page from a book by Raymond Unwin, who was a great garden city planner and architect. And he promoted these kind of groups of houses, not simply plunking houses. Partly it was to create a certain environment, but partly it was to create variety. He understood long before Levittown that if you built 2,000 houses and they're all identical, a house and a lot and a house and a lot and a house and a lot, it really gets boring. One of the wonderful things about Chestnut Hill is you have twins, you have singles, you have a few row houses, you have variety, just for its own sake is very important. Next. One of the young architects he employed was Edmund Gilchrist, and he built this very nice group on Linden Court on West Willow Grove. It's, I forget now, 6 houses on 1 acre. So this is both creating variety, but also increasing the density, not 1 house per half or quarter acre, but 6 houses on 1 acre. And the trade-off is you get less, you don't have a big private garden, but you have this very nice, next, shared garden in the middle, which nobody else has. So you get one thing and you lose another thing. Again, these are big houses. These are 5 and 6 bedroom houses. Gilchrist lived in one of these houses, I think the one near the corner, and he had a large family. He had a live-in servant. They had in-laws who would visit, the spinster aunts, the extended families in those days. So you have to imagine these houses, which don't look huge to us, are really occupied by a large number of people. Next. Gilchrist did a very nice group of houses around the corner. He really specialized in modest houses, as opposed to the mansion-type house, which is characteristic of much of Chestnut Hill. And these are based on a Cotswold architecture. Next. They're very interesting because they're row houses, but since they're separated by these lower pieces, you get some of the advantages of a freestanding house. You get windows on 4 sides of the house rather than just 2 or facing as in a row house. And again, very simple, not throwing money around, but the chimneys out of brick with these funny geometries. There's a lot of touches. And again, a radical type of housing. This is a house 1 foot from the sidewalk. If I suggested that today, there would be an uproar. You would say, you're squeezing people in, there's no privacy, how can you do that? These are beautiful houses that show exactly how you can do that very nicely. And the garden is in the back, so your lot becomes smaller. You don't have a front yard, you have private space in the back. Next. During designed this little court on Willow Grove called Baldwin Court, which always makes me think of Harry Potter because they're like little gnome houses on this little court. They were houses designed for chauffeurs mainly and domestic help. Many of the early houses didn't have garages. People weren't sure about, should you have a garage? Should you leave the car? So there's a communal garage that the Woodwards built in this area. And many large houses had no parking facility on the site at all. Next. And there's this wonderful space. Interesting, it's much smaller than Linden Court, but it's actually nicer because it's squeezed in. I don't live there, so I'm assuming you have to get along with your neighbors, but it's a beautiful space to look at, certainly when you're passing by. And this is taken just almost from the sidewalk. So it's a way of putting a lot of houses on a small piece of land. Next. Roanoke Court was one of the last projects that During and Woodward did together. It was 1931, the Depression was coming, and this really ends During's ability to build things on Chestnut Hill, and it kind of stops there. And when it restarts, he's no longer around to direct it, and it really takes very different forms. But this is a very interesting project because it's a group like the other groups, but it deals with the automobile. Next. There's a automobile court here. There's 8 houses, so there's 8 garages. And you have this court so you can turn around and get your car out. And then you have this common space with 8 houses arranged around it with really just drying space for laundry in the back. I wouldn't call it even a backyard. It's sort of the front yard, the common front yard is the green space of the houses. 8 houses on 1 acre of land. It's very, and certainly at that time you're talking about 45 persons per acre because these are big houses with a lot of people in them at the time. Next. And this beautiful center court, really marvelous now that it's grown out and the trees are big. You can barely, it's frustrating to photograph because you can't see the houses. They're all hidden here, which of course was the idea. And you have these little private places. Even though this is a kind of front yard where Americans use backyards, our front yards are just for show, this kind of reverses that, and the front yard becomes your outdoor green space. Next. The problem for taking these as models today is that these are very big houses. They're all lived in, and everything I'm showing you is lived in and very popular today. But they're large houses. This house has at least 5 or 6 bedrooms on 3 floors. So I wanted to show you an adaptation of this idea. This happened to be in Seattle, so the architecture is very different, but the idea is the same. Next. Jim Sewells is a developer who started this company called the Cottage Company, and he had this idea that towns around Seattle were experiencing real estate booms, and they were very concerned about the huge houses being built on lots. Houses get torn down and an even larger house gets built. And he started approaching townships and saying, we could build a lot of small houses instead of one huge house on this. This is 0.8 of an acre. You'll have to give us permission to do this because it's only zoned for one house, but these houses will be much smaller and they'll fit into your neighborhoods, they'll be less disruptive. And the typical projects, this is just one of them, there's maybe a dozen of these around Seattle, is that there's parking. This is 8 houses, so there's 8 garage spaces, and then there's visitor parking, which Woodward and During really didn't pay much attention to because most people didn't have cars in those days, but we do, so there's lots of extra parking. There's very small houses, 7 to maximum 1,000 square feet. So these are essentially 2-bedroom houses. And then there's a common building, because if you want to have a big party, that you can't fit it in your house, and so there's a commons building that you can use for either like an overflow from your house or for events. There's a garden here and then a big lawn here. So each house has some private space, very little, and then there's a big shared space. So it's sort of taking that During idea and adapting it to the way we live today. This is Seattle. So Seattle has a lot of very young people with large amounts of disposable income. They've just sold their Microsoft shares, which they got for nothing when they started working there. And so you have this unusual situation of people who are young, perhaps not married yet, but they can afford a house. And so these small houses are very expensive. I would say Chestnut Hill prices for a third the area. And they tend to be occupied either by single people or couples, maybe single mothers, but really quite quite small households, which are actually typical of today. We don't, the house, the sort of Leave It to Beaver household is just on reruns on TV. It doesn't exist anymore in terms of demographically. It represents a very small portion of the population. The much larger portion of the population are people living alone, people living with couples, mothers, unwed mothers, or people who haven't got married. We marry later than we used to. So this was an interesting experiment. Just as a footnote, he found this was extremely popular with young women. There was something about living with neighbors that close that was a very secure kind of situation if you were a young woman living alone, rather than living in a house on a street where you may not know your neighbors. There was a sense of community here which appealed to people. Next. And here's a view. Very beautiful little houses, very small. That's, I think, one of the challenges, for Chestnut Hill is how do you build houses like this, not architecturally, but small houses for small households. We have a great stock of big houses, but they only suit certain people today. Next. And I want to finish with an example from Charleston, which of course has a connection with the Woodwards. Woodward's son married a woman from Charleston who actually was a very big benefactor of historic preservation in Charleston. Charleston was a pioneer in historic preservation. In 1930, when zoning was just becoming, the Supreme Court had allowed that zoning was not un-American after all, and so most cities adopted zoning very quickly in the early 1900s, and Charleston was the first city to not just adopt, they adopted zoning, but they made a historical zoning district. Not just a residential district or an industrial district or commercial district. They said the oldest part of Charleston is a historic district, and that's going to be a special zone. And they were the first city in America to do that, and it became a model for other cities, including Philadelphia, because it was very successful. They set up all sorts of mechanisms to enforce these rules, but if you go to Charleston today and you notice, for instance, there are no high-rise buildings defacing this wonderful old city, that's one of the reasons, or why buildings have been preserved so successfully in Charleston is a result of this almost 100-year-old situation where they've controlled what happens in the city. Next. The typical lots in Charleston are extremely deep. When they laid out Charleston in the 17th century, they made these lots which were 200-300 feet deep. And so typically you have a house at the front and then a very large piece of land in the back. And this is a particular project that I've been studying in Charleston. These are existing houses, old houses. These have been renovated, as I'll show you. And next. And this is what's there now. So on this 1/3 of an acre, there are 7 houses. Most of these have a couple that, although here you have a couple with 3 children. Here you have a 2-bedroom house, a retired couple, 3 apartments in one house, also 3 apartments here and a house for a single person here. So altogether, you've got a density of about 50 persons per acre, extremely high density, because there are still 2 lots that don't have a house. There's a house possible here and a small one here. Charleston is encouraging these kind of infill projects. They want people to live in the city. You have to provide parking. You're only allowed to cover a certain portion of the lot, but you're allowed to build in the backs of these lots. And I think that's a very progressive attitude. This is downtown, by the way, pretty much on the peninsula in downtown Charleston. Next. This is one of the old houses at the front. This is called a single house in Charleston because it's just a single room with a veranda next to it to get lots of cross ventilation. It's a horrific climate in the summer. And you can see there's a veranda or a piazza, as they're called in Charleston, on each level, and then rooms. So as I said, this is 3 units. So you've probably got about 5 or 6 people living in this house. Next. 2 houses in the back. interestingly, this is very much like a freestanding Trinity House that were built in Philadelphia in the colonial period. So it's got a living space, a bedroom and a bathroom, and a bedroom and a bathroom. So it could be shared by people. There's a lot of medical facilities in this part of town and the College of Charleston. This house belongs to an architect. He has his workshop on the ground floor, and then his family, which is now 3 children, live on the upper 3 floors. It's a warmish climate, so the houses can be smaller, but I think it reflects a reality that if you want a house in downtown Charleston and you're not a mega millionaire that can afford the restored houses in the historic district, you have to have less space. You can't have as much space as your parents did. You can't have 1,500 square foot houses, you need 1,000 square foot, or this house has a footprint of less than 500 square feet. It's really just one room above the other. And as we know, Trinities are still popular and lived in Philadelphia, and they suit many people, and especially more today, as I said, there are smaller households. Next. This is a kind of cottage which actually has a garden in front of it. A retired couple live in this house. Next. This is a kind of curious Dutch feeling house, built for a single woman living alone. Parking is squeezed in. Parking is a big challenge in these projects. So here they squeeze a car in under the house in this kind of undercroft. This house is big enough, though, it has a room for rent, so a student can live on the ground floor. I think these kind of strategies are important. When we talk about densification, we shouldn't think high-rise buildings or not high-rise buildings. I mean, there are many strategies of fitting in things in appropriate places, not simply blanketing a community, so that you can accommodate different sorts of people and different requirements. Next. There's even this kind of historical building. It's based on a Palladian Villa. It's actually based on the porch of a Palladian Villa. Palladian villas are really quite big. And so this is the porch of the Villa Saraceno in the Veneto, turned into a house. So it's a 1-bedroom house, basically, here, and then 2 rooms upstairs that are rented and entered from the 2 sides. Next. I wanted to close with this quote from James Stirling, a great English architect. Architects have always looked back in order to move forward. So the architect of the house I just showed you looked at Palladio's houses. Palladio looked at the ancient Romans. And there's always been this communication over the ages between architects and buildings from the past and getting not just inspiration, but a kind of conversation with the past. It's what makes architecture so interesting, I think. And I thought that one could modify this quote next and say that communities have always looked back in order to move forward. So I hope when we think about what is the future of Chestnut Hill, and I haven't the faintest idea, so I'm glad I'm not on the panel. But when we think about that, we should think backwards as well as forward. We should remember that Chestnut Hill was not a natural kind of excretion of nature. It was a man-made place. People with a vision, certainly, of a future. But it was a man-made place, and it was an experimental place. People were trying things. It wasn't obvious that they were going to succeed. So there was a certain amount of risk involved in what people like Woodward were doing. And we can be thankful for that. It's what gives, I think, a lot of the architectural character and the built place character of Chestnut Hill was what those architects and developers did when they started out. Thank you.
So that was just fabulous to have, and very inspiring to have those words from both Nathaniel Kahn and Witold, thank you so much. That was terrific. I think what we hope to have tonight is a very lively conversation that engages all of you and is really the beginning of a longer conversation about the future of Chestnut Hill. So I just wanted to start by thanking the Chestnut Hill Conservancy for marking this milestone, this 50th anniversary of the Visionaries Roundtable. And I loved hearing the quotes from Louis Kahn. There was one that was used in a lot of the advertising for tonight, and clearly it was successful. We've got a big crowd here tonight. And I just might read that again in case anyone missed it. But Louis Kahn characterized Chestnut Hill as a spirit in which it seems as though the trees and gardens and the carefully scribbled streets have told everyone to be discerning about the steps they will take. So I think what we've heard from Witold is let's look to the past and look to the future and continue to be discerning. I also want to thank Laurie and our co-chairs who have just done a spectacular job, Shirley Hanson and Dan Macy, for gathering a very distinguished panel of experts tonight that will help us begin this conversation on urbanism, the historic preservation of buildings, watersheds, and public landscapes, and the architecture's role in building communities that matter. You're going to hear from our four distinguished panelists shortly, Richard Snowden, Inga Saffron, Bryan Hanes, and David DeLong. They, I think in your programs you have more extended bios, and so in order to get to the conversation, we're just trying to keep this short, but I thought I might further set the context with a few words, because Witold just told us about George Woodward and the Garden City, and how that was so influential, possibly, in Woodward's thinking of Chestnut Hill. But when I think of Philadelphia, I think Philadelphia more than any other city in the United States charts the history of this country in the architecture of its buildings, landscapes, and public parklands. So even William Penn, upon his arrival in 1682, was talking about a green country town. The Garden City, a public green space that it's been the core of the city plan since the 1600s. And then when you look at the historic houses and landscapes, such as Louis Kahn's Esherick House or Bob Venturi's mother's house, you go right up to the 1960s to these titans of modernism, as Nathaniel called them. So when we look not only in Chestnut Hill, but throughout the city, you can soak in the history of Philadelphia on the cobblestones of Alfred's Alley, or pop into something very contemporary, like the 21st century sleek tower of Comcast, and experience the latest technology and a very cool interactive video wall. But looking across not only the city, but across the Commonwealth, I think the rich diversity of people, communities, architecture, and landscapes is very evident, from the Amish communities in Lancaster to the country's most beautiful state capital in Harrisburg with its Mercer tiles and violet Oakley murals, and to the western part of the state with Frank Lloyd Wright's 1935 masterpiece in rural southern Pennsylvania, Falling Water. So our responsibility is to be good stewards of the historic, natural, and creative fabric, coupled with the need, I think, to embrace the contemporary and spark innovative change to make Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and Chestnut Hill a great place to live, to work, and to visit. So tonight, we want to initiate this thoughtful public discussion on striking a balance between preservation and change. And as Louis Kahn said, we need to be good stewards and take, quote unquote, those discerning steps in order to preserve what I would call the soul of Chestnut Hill and to embrace with measured changes what will be inspiring and central to the community in the future. So let me welcome our 4 panelists, and they will each, as we are arranging their seats here, they will each have an opportunity to speak to you for 5 minutes or so and describe their thoughts. And then we're going to get to your questions. I've already been given a summary of questions here that I think everybody participated in putting dots on the most treasured aspects of Chestnut Hill. What would we miss if it were to be lost, and what would you like to see change? So I think we'll start with introducing our panelists who are arriving momentarily, I hope, and then we'll get to not only some of my questions, but your questions. And as Laurie said, I would love to, I think a conversation is the best part of an evening. We really want to engage this group. It will take in order to find a wonderful solution to the future of this great community, it needs a broad and diverse opinions that can come into agreement. So let's welcome our panelists. I think we're going to, as everyone gets seated, I don't know, we've got an order, and so we're going to start with Richard Snowden, who I think most people know in this community, a developer and preservationist, followed by David DeLong, who is not only a preservationist, but an architect and historian, then Inga Saffron, an architectural critic, and concluding the first introduction of our panel, Bryan Hanes, a landscape architect. So why don't we begin, Richard, with you? Do you want to speak from your do you want to speak from your seat, or do you want to speak at the? Okay. Chair, I think, yeah. Why don't we? And then I'm able to have a spot here to ask questions. Start, please.
There have been certain core principles that have... Microphone. Sorry about that. How's that? Hello? There we go. Yay.
There we go. We got you.
There have been certain core principles that have guided our company since we started it 35 years ago, and I think it plays into a lot of what the conversation is going to be this evening. The first principle is do no harm. We tend to look at Chestnut Hill as a museum collection of buildings and landscapes, and I think it's very important not to hurt what's already there when you're doing what you need to do with these buildings. I've always been put to the mind of somebody confronting a Philadelphia highboy and taking a belt sander to it, and that's what happens to some buildings when they fall into the wrong hands. Scale, context, materials, the gardens, it all really matters, and these things have to be thought through very carefully when you're doing a project, or you're going to get kind of discordant music out of it. We believe very strongly that this kind of preservation principle protects the brand, which gives Chestnut Hill its value, both social value and also its value as real estate. If you harm that, you will no longer attract the vibrant and interesting people that have chosen to live here, despite being in a city which has challenges unto itself. Finally, we believe in leaving something on the table, and by that I mean building amenities into our projects. It's part of what gives the pleasure of the development process. And by this, we mean really beautiful architecture. I think choosing the right designers, the right architects is just of critical importance. And a number of the folks we've worked with over the last 30-some years are in this audience today, and I really applaud them because our projects would not be what they are without those folks. Easements, very, very important thing to try and do as part of a project. And try and keep in mind why you got into business in the first place, and that's what I try and think of, and that was to try and keep Chestnut Hill the lovely place that I found when I first came here, when I was born. Promoting positive development, I think, is a community-wide procedure and act. You can't just rely on developers to suddenly appear in Chestnut Hill who are going to be to your liking. The community needs to work to identify and encourage good development. And I really think that this is something that we need to be doing as a community in the future. And that means if you see someone, a younger developer coming along who is doing a good job on a project, be encouraging of it and try and support it. And I think the Historical Society has done a superb job with a couple of very difficult projects over the last year, and we should do this more. Don't oppose development just for the purpose of opposing it. Something is going to happen on these properties. People have property rights, and we need to respect them. It's a matter of accepting the fact that there's going to be change and trying to bend it to the way that keeps the community the way you want it to be. And I think most important is supporting informed and good community organizations. And we're blessed in this community to have those, and their support from everyone in the community is vitally important in order to make those kinds of developments occur. I guess I sort of close by saying, you know, the way we've approached our development work is to try, wherever possible, to stay within the fabric of the buildings that we've acquired. There are a few notable exceptions. One of them has the Fresh Market building in it, or Fresh Market in it. But we have chosen to try and weave the apartments and stores into the historic buildings and use parts of them that had not been used before to try and create interesting living spaces in the upper floors. That's really been kind of the hallmark of Bowman Properties, and we've built over 150 apartments on Germantown Avenue doing that, and they tend to be apartments for all different kinds of people. I would say that probably 15 of my employees live on Germantown Avenue with their families, so there are modest apartments and there are also much more elaborate ones, but they're all different sizes. And what it does is allow for a very diverse community in that neighborhood along Germantown Avenue. So that's, I think, how I would answer it.
That's superb. A great start to the conversation. David.
Thank you. Is this on? I was asked to speak or be prompted by the role of preservation in a developing or changing community. And basically, I would say, especially listening to Nathaniel and others, that the first role is to try to come to grips with identifying the spirit of the place. Difficult to do, but that spirit needs to be understood, and it needs to be maintained and reinforced. That has to do with saving what's here, but there's another very important aspect which has to do with guiding responsible change. Change is essential if a place is to continue to live. And I have long defined historic preservation as change responsive to the historic environment, and therefore that has to be balanced with what is saved. This, of course, leads to responsible development. Richard Snowden has indicated and shown in practice the kind of development that can enhance a place while maintaining the spirit of the place or its values. And I came to preservation from the world of development as an associate of a large architectural firm. my first preservation plan for a university campus was in fact called a development plan rather than a preservation plan, because it dealt with not only saving what was there, but addressing what was going to come. Now, how would I address things more specifically? First, I really think Chestnut Hill needs to be treated as a single conservation district. Now, Shirley Hanson suggested many years ago that it be a single historic district, and I think that is still very important. I would, however, like to see the preservation ordinance revised to include the possibility of a conservation district, which is more flexible and allows a different variety of changes and growth than the way historic districts are presently monitored. They seem to focus too much on individual buildings at the expense of the whole, and there are sometimes needless restrictions put on individual owners. To make this effective, I think that the Historical Commission and the Planning Commission need to be merged. The essence of preservation is planning, and planning needs to be addressing preservation with every step that they take. As an indication of how this could progress, I think that maps might be made that show two things. First, areas of preservation that need to be saved, not necessarily individual buildings, but clusters and areas and landscapes, and balanced by areas which are suitable for development, with a clear indication of the density that that development might take and a clear restriction on how far it could go. Something of this sort would inevitably require an examination of current zoning, and it might lead to downzoning and some restrictions on lot coverage. This is practically impossible to achieve. It requires an enormous amount of will on the part of the community. But I think that, to echo Lou Kahn's words, new things must have agreement, and agreement must grow from a community will to self-impose some of these directions and even restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you. Inga, in your career, you've put your keen and critical eye on building restoration and new development. I think it would be wonderful to hear from you, your sense of place in Chestnut Hill and your introductory comments.
Sure. So, good evening, everyone. In talking to Lori about tonight's event, she asked me to provide some context outside of Chestnut Hill, and I know you all do venture down into town occasionally, and if you've been there recently, you know that Philadelphia is experiencing a building boom like it hasn't seen since the early 20th century, when immigrants were flooding into the city to work in the factories, and neighborhoods that had been emptied out are, reviving and repopulating and rebuilding in an incredibly dramatic way in well beyond Center City, in what's called Graduate Hospital, at Fishtown, and Kensington, and West Philadelphia. And if you go to Northern Liberties right now, you go to 3rd Street between Spring Garden and Girard, I think virtually every house, every building on that stretch was built maybe in the last 10 years. And I do know, for just to give you a number, that in the last 10 years, there have been 16,000 property tax abatements handed out. So at least that many new houses or apartments built in 10 years. And that property tax abatement, as you may know, is driving this construction frenzy, because it makes it, much more affordable to buy a house if you don't pay taxes for 10 years. And so, the whole thing is just snowballed. And so most of it has been contained within the greater center, places that are accessible to the Market Frankfurt L or to the Broad Street line. But we've also seen the same kind of development in other neighborhoods, increasingly. your neighbors in Roxborough and Manayunk have seen very similar kinds of development that we're seeing in the greater center. And it's been very, very difficult for those communities because, like Chestnut Hill, they're much more in agreement with the landscape. There are single-family houses, wonderful old Victorian houses on big lots. The land values are probably less than they are in Chestnut Hill. And so what we've seen are, developers come, buy a single-family house, and then put, 8 or 10 houses on that lot, often with little care, unfortunately. And so they've really, really struggled, and recently have adopted a kind of neighborhood conservation district in an attempt not to stop development, but to have more say about the kind of development. One of the real scourges in Roxborough and that we've seen is instead of having little front lawns, the houses have paved driveways, in addition to having a garage at the ground floor. So, it's a double whammy. I don't think Chestnut Hill has seen that kind of development yet, but it may be coming because this tax abatement isn't going away, even though I've been arguing for modifying it for a while. And Chestnut Hill is very, very well positioned for development in the sense that it has great transit. It has, like Roxborough, it has some big houses on big lots. And, as a lot of people have been saying before me, that change isn't necessarily bad, but the challenge is, to control that change and make sure it happens in the best way. I think there are some arguments to be made for density. We heard Witold make some very, very good arguments. Density is such a dirty word because when people hear density, they think skyscraper. But I thought Witold did a great job of showing that density comes in many, many forms. And the really good thing about density, and for a community like Chestnut Hill, is that new buildings can really invigorate a community. They provide, they refresh the housing stock. They provide opportunities, as we heard, for young people to buy starter houses and increase the age diversity and economic diversity of a community. Having an increased population is really essential to supporting the shopping district on Germantown Avenue and to supporting the schools here and the churches. Those institutions won't be viable unless the population is continually refreshed. And the other good thing about new construction is you get different housing types. You might get apartments or condos like the ones that Richard Snowden built on Germantown Avenue. That makes it possible for people who own big houses when they get older to stay in the community and downsize. So new construction can really enhance a community, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. We also know that there are many, many large homes here that maybe in this modern world can no longer remain as single-family homes. So, what's the best way to convert them to condos or apartments? Create more density. So, as I said, the really important thing is how is this done? And I think it's really crucial to look at what else is going on in the city and to be proactive. Chestnut Hill is really lucky to have groups like the Conservancy that is doing this master plan to look at land use and historic resources in the community. And the city is doing this district plan, which will also examine what's here, what land is available for development and construction. And really what you have to do now, and to do proactively, is to decide as a community where is the right place to build, and what kind of building should go on that land. And I think the same is also true for preservation. You have to do an inventory of what's here. What's the most important? What are the most important buildings to protect? You have to look at the zoning classifications, so there are no surprises like we saw in Jewelers Row in Center City, where the buildings weren't historically protected and the zoning classification was the highest possible classification. And now there's a proposal for putting a 29-story building on this tiny little historic street. So I think it's really important. This inventory and this planning and thought process is really crucial for this community to say, building here is okay and building here is not okay. And I think you can even argue for design guidelines. There is, David, actually, Philadelphia does have neighborhood conservation districts. They're not used very much, and they haven't been very effective. But I think it's a great alternative to a giant historic district because it's a little more flexible. I think that's a possibility for creating a district where you can have a say about how things look. I think the key thing is to prepare for what's coming, to prepare developers also for, let them know what you expect, and because developers like predictability, and not to be afraid of change, but to be willing to manage that change.
Thank you, Inga. That was great. Bryan, you is a very talented landscape architect, and we've had, there are many landscape architects in Chestnut Hill. I think you have devoted your career to sort of striking the right balance between development and preserving open spaces. And so I hope we've heard about planned development, some of the wonderful big houses, but there are also large open spaces. So in your introductory remarks, it would be great to hear how you might strike the balance between the natural and built environments, and maybe touch upon what kind of economic incentives there may be for conservation of land and open spaces as well.
Great. Thanks, Gail. Was that good? One of the great delights of being the last in a long line of speakers is no doubt I'm going to repeat something someone said. And I'll start first by going back to that night in 1970 and back to one of Kahn's comments. And I think he really acknowledged that it was the intertwined nature of the landscape and the buildings that provide the character for this place. Part of that, I think, is due to a lot of the building traditions, the things that we saw through Witold's presentation, particularly a materiality to the architecture here. The great schist that I think everyone in this room knows is not schist, it's Wissahickon schist. It's a very specific kind of stone, and it's very unique to this place. It has a really limited geography. That geology has a very limited geography. It was given the name by Florence Bascom. Dr. Bascom was the first woman geologist in the United States and was a professor at Bryn Mawr. She spent most of her career studying in the Wissahickon. She was also the first to realize that it, how that great stone kind of delaminates. Great thing for kids, they peel it apart into the sheets of gold. So we kind of associate it with a sedimentary stone. She was the first to realize that it was metamorphic, that it was created by the heat and pressure of the earth, which was also what created the steeply sloped hillsides in the valley of the valley. It's also that valley, from that valley, that those great green fingers kind of extend up into the neighborhood and kind of give influence to all of the neighbors, the residents of the place. They interrupt the street grid and start to modify the experience of that street grid and communication between neighbors across valleys and across green spaces. It's ever-present kind of idea of the nature and wilderness in the city. It's unique to this place, I think. 2 weekends ago, you may remember it was a beautiful weekend, 70 degrees, one of the first great days. I put on shorts and went out for a walk through the valley, just as the leaves are starting to come on. It's that unique green to new foliage that tells all of us that the season's here, spring has come. It was a great experience and fantastic view to look under leafless trees to emerging leaves on the ground plane. Then you look a little bit closer and you realize those are all euonymus. All the gardeners in the room, the winged euonymus. Winged euonymus has taken over essentially 21 states. It's an invasive species. It's what we see on the surface as something that was brilliant and beautiful is actually causing a lot of damage, and it's taken over the native landscape of the place. That native landscape that, like the stone, forms an identity for the place. I guess in addition to the euonymus, there's a few acres of English ivy and pachysandra that had kind of taken over the forest floor. And I think I'm here to argue that I know I'm not a Chestnut Hill resident, but your reputation precedes you in how you argue for preservation of buildings within this neighborhood. And I think that same kind of fervent argument for the preservation of the character-defining architecture that is coming and that has happened and will continue to come should also be taken into account in the greater landscape, and especially the wild landscapes. Everybody's got beautiful gardens around here, but the shared landscape of the Wissahickon Valley, I think, is one that we should take greater strength in enforcing. I know the Friends of the Wissahickon have started to do that. We, have wandered around seeing some of the conservation, the preservation of some of those landscapes, and I think it's important that that is taken to the scale of the problem. To keep in mind that this is the beginning of a watershed that serves drinking water to the entire city of Philadelphia. Those great fingers serve a purpose. They're part of the infrastructure, part of the ecology of the place, and something that has great influence on the neighborhood as a whole.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to begin with a few questions, but as Laurie described, we're hoping that you will begin to put your hands up and deliver your questions to the side of the aisles and collect them, so we'll be asking them of our panelists as well. Brian, maybe just because you did talk about drinking water, I think let's talk again. Let's have all of you sort of join the conversation on how do you, when you're looking at literally the clean water and the health of our citizens, but also the health of the community, how do we strike the right balance? Maybe Brian can start, and then Richard, you, because I think you have worn two hats as a preservationist for many decades, and one who has been thoughtful, but at the same time developing parts of Chestnut Hill and beyond. So I think striking the right balance. Can you both speak to that while we gather some questions?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I think it's important seeing over the last few months where things are headed with things like the EPA. That groups like those of us in the room have to take kind of greater initiative, greater responsibility, and make greater efforts to start to work in to our daily lives, our normal routines, some of the preservation or the conservation. I'm going to stop saying conservation. Let's talk about preservation and rehabilitation in the way we do buildings. Because the reality is that is a degraded and blighted landscape. And if we were talking about buildings in the same way, there would be a huge outcry about it. So I think it takes the spirit of everyone and the efforts of everyone here to start to deal with a landscape that is really a communal or shared experience for everyone. It becomes the identity of the neighborhood. Everyone benefits from it, and everyone, I think, needs to kind of contribute back to it.
Well, the Wissahickon Valley is so important in terms of the water quality for the city of Philadelphia. And I think the most important project that the Conservancy has had, and it's really gone on since the early 1990s, is their conservation easement program. And I remember back in 1985 when Shirley, Nancy, and I were writing the historic district, we did a survey that year with a student intern, and we came up with, at that point, I think about 1,300 lots that could be carved out of the Chestnut Hill Historic District and developed as of right. We've now found that that number could even be higher, and we're doing a much more sophisticated study of that. Now, maybe 1,300 doesn't sound like that many lots when you're thinking of a Levittown type development, but in the entire historic district, there are only 2,800 buildings. So think about what kind of impact that would have, not only visually, but in terms of the water runoff in Chestnut Hill. And really, you could extend it into Mount Airy and Germantown, the less developed areas of West Mount Airy and West Germantown near the park. Programs to conserve land, to give landowners an incentive and some sort of fair return on their property through their gift are absolutely critical. And this is something that I think you're going to see the Conservancy spending a lot of time not only trying to convince property owners, but also developers to participate in.
I want to just add something from the audience, from the group, because people who came in, one of the questions, and it ranks the highest, it got the most number of dots on what would you like to see change, and the answer was by far there should be more incentives for historic preservation and land conservation. So I think it sounds like the audience, we're working towards an agreement here, and at least in terms of an overarching goal. The challenge is always the process. David, you had some great ideas about development, and I'd like to hear a little bit more from you. I mean, if you think big, your big ideas, and how would you implement a plan?
Well, it's not easy, but I think it begins with the mayor's office, and maybe the task force announced yesterday will help. I hope there's Chestnut Hill representation on that task force. The second thing is the Historical Commission desperately needs to be reinforced. It needs better funding, it needs a larger staff. It's woefully weak, and that has got to be a very top priority. Only when it is strengthened, when they're strong enough to be a partner with planning, could the two begin to merge. All of this is political, and it's discouraging to think of any of it happening anytime soon, although I hope it can. I think there might be some private incentives too. I wish that there could be a revolving fund here in Chestnut Hill, which would make it possible to assemble developable plots and then resell them with restrictions in place and with the architect selected. And there's also a plan that Columbus, Indiana has used successfully for many years, which is another kind of fund which pays for the architect's commissions with the stipulation that those architects be chosen from a very carefully drawn up list. Those are two ways in which local energies and local efforts might be more quickly put to the test than waiting for the city itself.
Very, very interesting. So here, just to respond and share the results of the, also of what do you treasure most about Chestnut Hill's built and natural environment? Again, the number one was the historic village character. And we've heard from Witold that, the historic is not so historic. It's 100 years old in terms of what is developed in Chestnut Hill. But even when you think of the 1950s, Richard, I think, you and I talked at one point very briefly about what Chestnut Hill was like in the 1950s, how it's developed, what it looked like then. And then I'd like Inga to just speculate on what you think would be optimal to see in the next 50 years. So, Richard, why don't you begin? Give us a picture of what the 1950s. I think you mentioned neon signs and...
A little point of clarification, since I was born in 1957.
But you know your history
I'm
of
getting
this
some
community.
of this secondhand, but if my mother, Julie Snowden, was here, she'd say, growing up in Chestnut Hill during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the Chestnut Hill Business District was not a very attractive place. It was like a lot of strips anywhere in Philadelphia. There were neon signs, there were a mishmash of changed buildings, and it was actually the vision of a fellow who a number of people in this room will remember, Lloyd Wells, who came in and gave, to some degree, form and function to a lot of the institutions that we take for granted today, the Community Association, the Historical Society, and others. And Lloyd was a character. He was doing this before there were a lot of fancy names for it, various town planning ideas. And what he wanted was to have parking for his hardware store, which was where the Hill Company was. So he started the Chestnut Hill Parking Foundation. And he found that he needed infrastructure to get things done and to be able to speak to the city of Philadelphia as some sort of a united force, particularly when they were demolishing a particularly beautiful estate where Chestnut Hill Village is located now. And thence was born the Chestnut Hill Community Association. And Lloyd was both a founder of these various organizations and constantly at war with them and with a lot of people in the community. He was known when people would not take down their neon signs to sneak out in the middle of the night and snap them off. He had a very definite vision. He wanted to colonialize Chestnut Hill, which I remember arguing vociferously with him about that. But he had this idea, and I'll tell you, a lot of it was not my cup of tea, but a lot of it is what has given us the ability to do things like this today. And that was Chestnut Hill in the 50s, and as they say, we've come a long way, baby. And with that,
Well, I might just say we've come a long way, maybe.
Maybe. Right.
But so Inga, when you think of the future, I mean, even a retail corridor, can it remain vibrant when nationwide brick and mortar stores are disappearing? So whether it's 50 years in the future or 15 years in the future, what would you envision?
Well, I think retail is a real challenge, and there's been a lot of discussion about this lately. That the whole internet shopping thing is really moving at warp speed, and we just, I worry for all our downtowns what the future will be. But you might be able to argue, just like after the fall of the giant bookstores like Barnes & Noble and Borders, the ones that were left standing were the small, privately owned bookshops where you had a lot of personal attention and customer service, and that were very well curated, and maybe small shopping areas will survive in this age of internet shopping, and so that might be a point in favor for Germantown Avenue. As far as the architecture, I love this story about Germantown Avenue being colonialized after World War II. It's a fiction. It's not. It's this invention of what Chestnut Hill is. It isn't really true, and so you can invent your idea of Chestnut Hill. I think you're really lucky to have both. This huge stock of 19th century architecture, but this amazing stock of modernist architecture. And so you're not totally boxed in. You can accept new architecture. You could even, in your design guidelines, argue in favor of the newest ideas about architecture and welcome them here. That could be really interesting, and that could continue to make Chestnut Hill a vital and an important place.
That's great. And so while you're talking about the diversity of architecture and welcoming, I want to welcome Witold back to the stage for the a question and answer period. And while you're coming up to your chair here, I might just talk a little bit about, you ended your talk with James Stirling's comment, architects have always looked back in order to look forward. And I think maybe a modern day translation of that might be back to the future. But as you've heard this description here, what would you, looking to the future, Witold, do you want to add a few comments before I share the questions from the audience?
In an earlier version of my talk, I had a quote from Evelyn Waugh, a writer that I admire a great deal, and he said, the only thing we know for certain is the past. So I don't know what the future is. But I do know that cities are impossible to predict because there's so many forces on cities. The biggest of which is the citizens themselves. These millions of people who make decisions on their own in ways that are unpredictable today completely. Just one further comment on that. When Ed Bacon became the city planner for Philadelphia in the 1950s, he saw a city that was growing, that needed plans for expansion because he was a planner, so he made plans. We lost a quarter of our population in the next 50 years. He should have been planning for contraction instead of expansion. I'm not blaming him completely. I'm just saying that it's very difficult to predict, especially if you're in the trenches the way he was. It's very difficult to know what's happening. And if somebody had suggested that Philadelphia would lose 25% of its citizens, it sounded outlandish. Nobody would have expected that. Just as nobody would have expected that Philadelphians would be riding bicycles. What a curious notion. I mean, the Dutch rode bicycles, but Americans don't ride bicycles, and yet we are. And I'm sure we will be increasing that in the future. So the future is very difficult to predict, and I've been very skeptical of the American lust for knowing the future. Our newspapers are full of it, but so I have nothing to say about the future of Chestnut Hill.
We could tell all night that you had nothing to say, so this is great. Here's a question from the audience for everybody. What are the forces of change? Shouldn't we start with what brings about change? Tax policy, I mean, Inga mentioned tax policies. Are there other forces that bring about change?
I think greed does.
Greed. Expand upon that, David.
I think the biggest problem with the wrong kind of development is selfish people. Mr. Kahn said a word or two about that, and Nathaniel reminded us of his words, that it's the thought only of one's personal achievement, irrespective of community values. One can make, as we see in many parts of the world today, and especially in this country, one can make a great fortune irrespective of what follows. You simply leave that community or that place and move on to another with money in your pocket. So to me, greed is the biggest enemy of change, although also the greatest stimulant.
Maybe I put a little different spin on that. I don't deny that there's a lot of greed. I think if you look back to Henry Houston and George Woodward and how they financed their development, they had their own money, I presume, and they had time. They didn't have banks on their backs or investors demanding a return. Today's developers are really just like intermediaries. They organize the project, but they have bosses too. Those bosses are the investors, and it's who want a return in a certain amount of time. And almost all new construction is subject to the demands of this financial marketplace. And I think it is one of the big reasons that most of today's everyday architecture is really terrible. I've written a column saying, there's, except for universities and art museums and very occasionally a wealthy person with taste, there's almost no good architecture being built in our country right now. Or if it happens, it's just like a miracle of chance. Because, the money, and the demand for return and the demand to make everything more efficient and cheaper and it's just so strong. And it's really, really difficult to get a good building today. And I see Richard wants to answer that.
No, but I think you're right, and I think in a nutshell, that's the challenge we have when we're trying to preserve buildings and land. And I've seen it over and over again. It's acted itself out just over the last year with a couple of projects that the Conservancy has tried to help with. You can have people who have loved this community their entire lives and would lay down their lives for Chestnut Hill, but when you're dead, the dead have no rights. And the heirs come along and they want the property sold or a trust or whatever, and you're stuck, and these things happen. And I think those are the sorts of things we should be planning for. I agree with Witold. You can't sit here and angst about the future. I think what you have to do is be flexible and ready to manage change. And I look at the last 35 years we've been in business on Germantown Avenue. I would have thought as a kid in my 20s, my castles in Spain might have come from commercial space. And in fact, it's the apartments that have been the revenue generator for our company over the years, because people really want to live in Chestnut Hill. And the challenge for our community, or our commercial corridor, is going to be how do we reimagine a lot of those first floor commercial spaces in ways that still keep a vibrant commercial corridor. It's going to mean shrinking the sizes of them. I mean, we did a development in the old Children's Place store, which some of you may have remembered as Dorothy Bullett's way back in the day. That store is now cut this way in half. There is an entrance in the back, and there's a 2,000 square foot Berkshire Hathaway office. We were able to maintain the commercial streetscape in the front and create spaces that we hope are much more marketable because they're smaller. We're going to need to take the backs of some buildings and make first floor apartments out of them. These will all require variances. But it's responding to the way things just change in life. Who could have predicted the internet situation, 15 years ago, destroying our retail stores? But these are the things we just have to respond to and not angst about it, just be ready to go when it happens.
One
Well,
more.
I think
Yeah,
that's,
one more.
I think, Richard, you mentioned in your earlier comments that one of the challenges is to choose the right architect. And clearly, we've had some brilliant architects who have built homes here. We've heard about them tonight. David, you've been a curator. You've curated a number of exhibitions on Louis Kahn and Bob Venturi and Frank Lloyd Wright in your career. Who should take, this is a question from the audience, if you take a curatorial approach to preservation and conservation, who is the curator?
First of all, I've always disagreed with the curatorial approach. Jim Fitch is the one who said that, and I think that suggests preservation is a very restrictive action. It has to be joined with a more flexible approach. So curating is part of it. That's part of the mentality of knowing what should be saved, but it's only a part. It's not the whole story. So I do not take a curatorial approach to preservation. I hope I take a more aggressive approach. And I know at Penn, I try to have a very liberal program. We really try to examine all the rules, and we fight those rules that we think are overly restrictive and too small-minded.
Okay, I think we have about 15 minutes before we conclude our panel discussion. So I want to ask all of you, what are the 3 big ideas of the Chestnut Hill Community Association and Chestnut Hill Conservancy should pursue over the next 5 years to secure a prosperous and exciting Chestnut Hill for the next 20 years? 3 big ideas. We got 5 of you. Tough one.
You stumped the pan?
And while you're thinking of that one, dead silence.
I have.
Okay, great. We've got a big idea.
There are no big ideas. I think we have to start with that. It's a mistake to think that a city can be managed or handled or designed with a big idea. That's what got us into trouble, really from the 50s on, was the big idea syndrome. Public housing was a big idea. Urban street malls was a big idea. And I think cities are, as Jane Jacobs said, very delicate little things that are constantly trying new things. Some of them work, some of them don't work. But when we get the big ideas, when we get in trouble, because when it fails in a big way by definition. And little ideas can fail, and you can deal with it.
Experimentation.
As Rich said, yes. But
Wins and
experimentation
failures.
on a small scale, very un-American. Small scale.
Small scale.
I agree with you, and I'll tell you from Chestnut Hill's history, a big idea that I think has always been a terrible thing. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, people in the Community Association and Lloyd Wells again really pushed the notion that you could fix the traffic problem on Germantown Avenue by widening Stenton Avenue to 4 lanes. That was the big idea that was going to be Chestnut Hill's Beltway. I think it's a terrible idea. It divided us from the section of Wynmoor that is historically really part of Chestnut Hill and created a raceway through our community. So I agree with you. I think, keep it small.
I think Interstate 95 is an indication of a big idea gone wrong. It cut off, as all of us know, the Delaware waterfront from the river. It almost cut off Andalusia from the river. And interstates have caused problems throughout the country. It was a big idea that was not all wrong by any means. It certainly was effective in parts of the Midwest where one couldn't travel very easily from place to place, but desperately wanted to. So big ideas. I'm from the Midwest, obviously. Big ideas need to be approached very, very carefully and with great suspicion.
Big ideas in landscape, in preserving open spaces, Bryan?
Well,
even examples anywhere in in the country.
I wanted first to tag on to David's comment relative to the landscapes and buildings. Independence Mall is another one of those big ideas where we tore down 9 square blocks of historic, structures of the city in the heart of the old part of the city. For green space, which, hey, I'm an advocate for, but, the sacrifice was probably more than necessary for a little colonial building. So.
Inga.
Well, I agree that the big ideas are dangerous, but you can have values. Right. You can identify what your values are, that you want to control your destiny, try to manage change in a positive way and not reject all new things or all new development, that you can conserve land, not just, in your boundaries, but connect it to the communities around you. I'm sure there are a lot more on that list, but you can have sort of general goals and values to think about. I think you're really lucky because you haven't been overwhelmed yet in the way that other communities have been. And you can see, what's happened there, and you can prepare.
Well, I think if there are no more questions from the audience, oops, there's one here. Did you? I put it on the slip. Okay, I might have thought the one question, is this yours? What is the best way to? Oh. Oh, see back. I don't think sorry. Why don't you ask your question?
Well, okay, it's got a pretty long preamble, but Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities were part of the social reform movement for working people. And much of those houses that the Woodwards built throughout this neighborhood were the workforce housing of their day. Workforce housing is once again a very hot topic in the city. It seems to be on everybody's lips. I can't go anywhere without somebody talking about, I'm building workforce housing. Is there room in today's and tomorrow's Chestnut Hill for this sort of affordable workforce housing that's in character with what's happened in the past and what may happen again?
And I just want to repeat very, hopefully succinctly, but the question for those who might not have heard it in the back is workforce housing. I think we heard earlier about building for a diverse community, and is there room for workforce housing in Chestnut Hill?
Well, you've got to have it, or you don't have a community. So yes, there has to be room found for workforce housing. Certain cities in California are attempting that through legal regulations to guarantee a certain percentage of workforce housing when the housing has become unaffordable to those who need to work there. So I don't know enough about Chestnut Hill to guess how or where. I'm sure some exists already, but I'm sure more is needed.
We actually have pretty diverse housing, and Chestnut Hill, it's an anomaly to say that it's all mansions on the park. I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that 75 or 80% of the Bowman workers work and live in this community. Their children go to Jenks School. They shop here. And we've developed over time a mix of apartment types. I mean, I joke with our staff and say, we have Pierce Arrow apartments, we have Chevrolet apartments, we have apartments for all different kinds of people. And that is important to having the diversity in a community. I'll tell you one of the real problems, and it's been the elephant in the room that no one's asked a question about, are the schools. And we have a real problem in Chestnut Hill where, and it just played out again last week. Good friends of ours with a little boy who's 5 years old are moving to Lower Marion Township. And this fellow owns a business on Germantown Avenue, currently lives in a very nice twin on Ardley Street, but he does not have faith in the public school system in the city of Philadelphia. This happens over and over again. And what we're getting now is, very, very wealthy people with children, or people who have no children that might be middle class who can stay here because they don't have to worry about it. And that's not a community. So we've got to figure out a way to figure this out.
Well, I think that's a great way to conclude we can extend for another 5 minutes, but I think there's a great way to conclude the comments tonight, and maybe one last remark that each of you would like to make, just in terms of how do you make sure that you have a vibrant community, a diverse community. I think that going back to the respect for the past, but recognition that everything was contemporary at one point, and how can we build new incentives, build new structures that create a vibrant community going forward that can support better schools and transportation and a commercial corridor. So I think if you want to wrap up with one final comment on any other elephants in the room or your last remarks for this lively panel discussion.
Yeah, I'll wrap up real quick with just the discussion that was just happening. I think there are examples of those things. Witold just showed us opportunities for more affordable housing. I think we can look at the Penn Alexander School as a model for how to start to deal with problems in our public schools. I think, I'm going to stick in West Philly and think of some of the park spaces that we have over there and wonder if there's a way that Pastoris Park becomes something better than the best dog walking park in the city.
Inga?
So to address the two issues of workforce housing and schools, I do think preservation of older buildings, small older buildings, is a way of preserving affordability. And Chestnut Hill, as Richard said, does have a lot of smaller buildings, and all those Woodward houses, all those apartments on Germantown Avenue, that's where people are going to find affordability. That's where, people starting out can live. And also, as you think about density, think about those images that Witold showed, where you can get, 6 houses on less than an acre. And then about the schools, my daughter went to Philadelphia Public Schools, lived to tell about it. Isn't too mad at me. What I've seen as so many neighborhoods, around the center have exploded with development is that a lot of young couples and young families have gotten together even before their kids are in school and formed groups to support the schools. And we've seen a number of schools like Chester Arthur and Stanton really be transformed by their fundraising, by their efforts to build playgrounds and start tutoring efforts, and also to champion people staying in the neighborhood and sending their kids to public school. And so if that's not happening at Jenks now, I think it's really vital that that kind of support network be established to make sure it is a worthy public school.
I think preservation, as I mentioned earlier, has to be locally considered and locally conceived. So far that's happened, and I think you have to be very careful about outside rules being imposed. To capture the spirit of a place, you were the spirit. And happily, as Venturi said 50 years ago, Chestnut Hill never had the collapse of certain other places, so you're already ahead of many other places and communities, and that has to be maintained through a strong effort. It's not going to take care of itself, but local effort.
I'm going to say one thing about Jenks before I make my comment, and that is they are doing amazing things there. And that was not meant to disparage Jenks at all, believe me. I think if we want a vibrant community, it's up to the folks out in this audience to be involved. And I sit on the board of the Conservancy and also the Chestnut Hill Community Association, and both struggle for membership. And to me, that is a disgrace because you need those organizations to do all the wonderful things that everyone's talking about in these questions. The Chestnut Hill Community Association, as maddening as it is at certain times in my life, believe me, is the way this neighborhood speaks to the city of Philadelphia 12 or 13 miles down the pike. And if it's not there and populated by folks who are in this room and beyond this building, we're really in a world of hurt. Similarly, the Conservancy, I want to tell you, going to battle on these bad developments or trying to get land to be conserved is an extremely expensive situation. It's not just a matter of volunteers. It's a matter of keeping the lights on and doing all the hard blocking and tackling that make these things possible. If you're not engaged, if you're not a member, and the bad things happen, shame on you.
Witold.
Oh, I want to recycle another quote that I pulled out of my talk because I think I found it really inspirational. And it's not a Philadelphian, but it's a Pennsylvanian. It's a quote from Andrew Carnegie. And I was looking for quotes about the future, and he said, if you do your duty and a little more, the future will take care of itself. and I realized the key to that quote was a little more. Doing your duty, he came from a generation where he almost took that for granted. We can't anymore. So doing your duty is not easy. But a little bit more, I think, was the key. And that's what struck me about Woodward and his architects. They were always doing more. They weren't just doing good architecture. They were trying to go beyond what was necessary to find something more. And I think the key to a community success is ultimately that hard to define extra that people put in and that finally creates the community and all that it follows from it.
Well, thank you. I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up. And I think you're wrapping up with the collective responsibility and the idea that coming to a collective agreement on how to move forward with little projects and experimentation that can succeed is a fabulous message to end with. So let's also give an applause not only to our panel, but to the Chestnut Hill Conservancy for making a great evening.
Hello, I'm Eileen Javers. I'm the president of the Conservancy, and this will be quick. But heartfelt. I want to thank our sponsors. I want to thank our visionaries, Nathaniel, Witold, Gail, Richard, David, Inga, Bryan. Thank you so much. I want to thank our staff for making this all happen and the volunteers tonight. And I also want to thank our co-chairs who've done such a fantastic job. Dan Macy, who not only lives and breathes preservation, but lives in preservation. Yeah. And Shirley Hanson. James Stirling stole my line because what I had written to say about Shirley is, as one of our co-founders, for the last 50 years, she has preserved our history to inform our future. Thank you, Shirley. And now I am told that we have 10 flavors of yogurt waiting for us now at our frozen yogurt social. So please join us all, and thank you for coming. It's been fabulous.